This is a Genesis CD. This is the first Genesis album, released in 1969. It's okay. It's not great, but it's alright. This is Trespass. This was their second album, released in 1970. It's not as good as the first one, but it's okay. It's got The Knife, which is got good parts to it. This is fucking nursery crime, bitch. This is fucking awesome. This is amazing music. What changed? Released in 1971, 1 year after Trespass. What happened? How did they go from, yeah, it's alright, to awesome? How did that happen? Phil Collins. That's how that happened. Steve Hackett too, granted, but Phil Collins. He joined the group. This was his first album with them. And suddenly, it was like the ideas from the first two albums suddenly had something pulling them together. Something that glued it all together and made it work. And that was his drumming. Which the first two albums sucked as far as drumming goes. Genesis didn't even really have an official drummer. The drummer in the band wasn't even really considered a member. Genesis in Nursery Crime suddenly had that rhythm to it that pulled everything together, and it suddenly worked. And in Foxtrot, their very next album, the very next year, it got even better. I mean, the ambition of Foxtrot is really amazing when you think about Supper's Ready, the main track on here, which is like almost a half an hour long. It's an amazing piece of art that would never have worked without Phil Collins. It would never have, it would have fallen apart completely. Because there's these key changes, and it's really weird, and I think it would have turned a lot of people off, even progressive rock fans, if not for this beat that kept everything together, that cemented it as a thing to exist. And it kept getting better. They had their first hit song, the very next album, Selling England by the Pound. They had I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. And that's Phil. That's Phil. I mean, the words are probably mostly Peter Gabriel. But really, if you listen to that song, which is classic Genesis now, all Genesis fans like it, that is Phil Collins right there. That song wouldn't have existed. It wouldn't have made it to the album. I don't think they would have written it if they didn't have the ability to write it, because they had Phil. They were able to do it because of Phil. And then the final Peter Gabriel album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The ambition and scope of this album is mind-boggling. And again, I say to you, no Phil Collins, this album wouldn't have made it. My personal opinion, no Phil Collins, the band wouldn't have made it. The band wouldn't have made it this far. I don't think they would have gotten past the third album. Because it was sort of strike one, strike two. I think if there'd have been a strike three, I think that the album bombed, I think they would have just walked away and said, we're going to go off and be doctors or whatever. Phil was the one that made them a band, in my opinion. And everyone hates them for it. Everyone hates them for it. And I know I've covered this subject to death, but it's time to do the video version. And thank you to Mr. Smooth for giving me the idea about addressing Genesis. Not my tits. Genesis. Everyone thinks he ruined it. Oh, you know, Genesis was a great band till Phil Collins took over, and then he made it go mainstream and poppy. Stop right there. This is a trick of the tail. This is a fantastic album that is equal to anything ever done in the Gabriel era. It is better than a lot of what was done in the Gabriel era, and I'll tell you why. It was because, and this is Genesis 2.0 at this point, okay? This is Phil Collins taking over as the lead singer. After The Lamb, that was it. Even if Gabriel had stayed on, the next album, what would it have been? What would it have been? This was a, you know, at the time, 4-album rock opera. Where would you have gone? Where could you possibly have gone after The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway? There was nowhere to go. And that, you know, what would have happened is prog rock would have continued to disintegrate. It never really was like this big, huge juggernaut sound. And when it completely died in the late 70s, that would have been the end of Genesis. There wouldn't have, you know, they would have gone the way of all the other prog rock bands that just sort of, who remembers them now? You know, they don't exist. You can't even find their albums anymore because they never bothered to make CDs of them. They're definitely not on iTunes anywhere or anything like that. Genesis would have just disappeared. Phil Collins, what he did with this, and Phil didn't write any of these songs, by the way. You know, up until this point, the lyrics he wasn't really involved in. You know, he was the guy behind the scenes working on the music. And what he did here with his voice was he sort of became this, it began this transition period where, and he began it immediately. I mean, definitely on stage he did. But even in the album itself, even though they're not his words, there's a warmth to his voice that Peter Gabriel never had. There's a little bit more of a, you know, it was always, Phil always said that Peter was the mysterious traveler and he was the bloke next door. And that's it. That's exactly right. It was this sort of saying, hey, come on in. Yeah, you guys down there in the audience who sort of watch us and, you know, see Peter Gabriel as this sort of god in all these different costumes and makeup and all this stuff. No. Come on up here with me. Come on. Let's have a good time. Let's just enjoy ourselves. And suddenly, this was their biggest hit. Trick of the Tail was their biggest hit album up to that point. And then the next album, Wind and Wuthering, was also a big hit. Why? Because it was this inviting the audience. It was saying, okay, we see where this is going. We see punk rock is coming in, and punk rock was saying, oh, these guys suck. These guys are all shit, you know, from like the 60s and 70s. They, you know, we're the true music sound. And people were getting into punk, and bands like Genesis were being forgotten. And there was only one way to combat that, and that was to do what punk wasn't doing, which was to be fun and to do what Genesis always did and did up till the end, which was to have this orchestral quality to the music. Where punk rock, and I love punk rock, but it's, you know, it's the anarchy of the music that is what's great about punk rock. With Genesis, it's the arrangement. These guys were musicians in the classical sense of that word. And Phil was too, even in his own solo music, which I'll say is definitely poppier than anything that ever made it onto a Genesis album. You know, I can't see Tony Banks sitting there playing Sussudio. But, you know, he was able to bring a human quality to that. He was able to not be the composer up on stage with his back turned to the audience, you know, the conductor or whatever. He was sort of wanted everybody to have a good time and have fun. And that came through with And Then There Were Three. Not my favorite Genesis album. I think Steve Hackett left, and they really kind of lost their footing for a little while. But Follow You, Follow Me, first real hit song that Genesis ever had, like where it was played on the radio all the time. This is something that Peter Gabriel never could have done. It was a love song, and it was just sort of an unabashed, just something that, you know, I maybe somebody out there can help me out with the word I'm looking for. It's something that just, you hear it and it's stuck in your head for the rest of your life. And that's it. You will never forget that song. And one of my favorite Genesis songs, one of my favorite songs, period. I mean, I will find myself, no matter how long it's been since I've heard it, humming that song at least once a week. At least. It's just all of a sudden in my head. And yet they continue to make great art albums as well. Duke, which may possibly just be the best Genesis album. It was, you know, I think Phil knew, and I think that Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford knew as well, that they wanted to keep their old fans. There's this idea that when Phil came along, they just basically said, fuck the old fans. We don't care about the old fans. We want to be embraced by mainstream, and especially mainstream America. That's horseshit. That's horseshit. First of all, Duke has songs like, okay, Behind the Lines, yes, I can see that being more of a little bit more mainstream. Duchess, guide vocal, Heath Hayes, Cul-de-sac, Duke's Travel, Duke's End, those are nowhere near anything that you would ever hear on the radio. And that's true of the next one, and this is where people really started to hate Phil Collins, where, you know, the real divide began, which is Abacab. Definitely more pop than Duke was. But again, even the, you know, Abacab, the title track, that's what is Abacab? Listen to the lyrics of that. They weren't sitting around going, you know, how do we write, you know, like Baby Baby or something like that? How do we write like a Justin Bieber kind of thing? That's not what Phil Collins and Genesis were ever about. Abacab, what does that even mean? You know, songs like Dodo and Lurker or Keep It Dark. Those songs were played on the radio, and it wasn't because that was the style and Genesis was embracing the style. Radio came to them, and came to them big with the Mama album, which, you know, Mama, I mean, okay, That's All is very much something that can be played on the radio. Mama is not, and Mama was played on the radio. Mama is a song about, you know, basically wanting to murder a prostitute, and radio embraced it. Why? Because they were like, these guys are awesome. Listen to this song. This is cool. And that was Phil Collins. That was Phil Collins saying to Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, you know what? We've got to, you know, open up to our audience a little bit more. And they did it big time with Invisible Touch, of course, the album that every Genesis fan but me hates. And yeah, this is filled with pop songs. Invisible Touch, Tonight, 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 Land of Confusion. Those are all, Throwing It All Away. Those are all, were played on the radio and could be played on the radio. But then there's songs like The Brazilian. There's songs like Domino. Um, Land of Confusion, which I don't think was necessarily something that was being played on the radio at the time. But Phil was able to mold Genesis, with the help of Tony and Mike, by the way, who were also doing sort of poppier numbers in their solo stuff, into a band that was accessible to people. And by the way, Peter Gabriel did the same thing. For everybody who was like, well, Peter Gabriel would never have done that. Sledgehammer. What now? We Can't Dance. Another popular album that Genesis fans hate. What could you have done? Did you want them to continue to do prog rock in the way prog rock had been done? Because first of all, there is prog rock on this album. Fading Lights. The instrumental part of Fading Lights. Driving the Last Spike. That's a 10-minute song. Who was doing 10-minute songs in 1991 when this album came out? Then we come to the last Genesis album, Calling All Stations. It's alright. It's a good album. I don't hate it. A lot of Genesis fans hate Calling All Stations, hate Ray Wilson. I don't hate him. I like Calling All Stations. It's good. But it's down there with the first two albums. And why is that? Phil was gone. He left the band. And the band didn't continue. That was it. That was the end of Genesis recording albums. And it would have been the end a lot earlier had Phil Collins not joined that band. For everybody who hates him, for everybody who's, he ruined Genesis and his solo stuff is crap, let me tell you something. Here's a big problem that I have with just people in general and how they treat art. The idea that, mainstream stuff is just crap and it's all, nobody respects mainstream stuff. I mean, we like our little independent things. I like it too, okay? That's the thing. I like little indie movies. I like little indie bands. I like, things that are off the beaten track. But if you look at my 100 favorite movies, it's filled with blockbusters and classics and movies that everybody knows. With a few little movies like The Fountain thrown in there that are sort of more off the beaten track. There's a reason that mainstream art works. There's a reason that Genesis went mainstream and survived. Because mainstream is just, it's a lot of people enjoying something. It's an artist reaching out to his audience and saying, I kind of know what you want. Let me see what I can do and see if I can put my own spin on it. Wizard of Oz is mainstream. Casablanca is mainstream. These are, there's always been a mainstream, and if enough time passes, suddenly it becomes art. The Beatles were mainstream. It was what kids wanted at the time, and this band knew it, and they went out and they did it. They weren't the first to make music like that. They just sort of said, okay, this is what's popular, we're going to do this. And now they're gods, Phil Collins is a mainstream artist who does like off-the-beaten-track things and did off-the-beaten-track things, like his involvement in the jazz fusion band Brand X. None of you knew. How many of you, raise your hand, know what Brand X is? You don't, because you never went out and you sought that out. The only thing you know about Phil is Sussudio, In the Air Tonight, Invisible Touch, the mainstream stuff, because that's what made it out there. You can't fault artists when their art is embraced. You can't turn around and say, we liked you when no one else did, but now that everybody likes you, you suck. That makes you a snob. And that's not Phil Collins' fault. That's your problem if you can't accept, mainstream art.